Hello, everyone, and welcome to an afternoon with Candas Jane Dorsey. My name is Anita, and I work at ECW Press, where we recently published the second novel in the Epitome Apartment Mystery series, What's the Matter with Mary Jane, which Candas will be reading from today. Followed by the reading, our good friend Janice MacDonald will host a Q&A. For anyone joining us this afternoon, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box or the chat, and we will try our best to get to them. So without further ado, let me introduce Janice and Candas. Our moderator for this event, Janice MacDonald, is best known for the Randy Craig Mystery Series, the first detective series set in Edmonton, Alberta. Janice has also produced nonfiction, short fiction, which appears on beer cans, I found out today, a children's book, drama, and music. She spent more than a decade teaching literature, communications, and creative writing at MacEwan University. And now she keeps the government of Alberta safe from dangling modifiers. Candas Jane Dorsey is the award-winning author of Black Wine, A Paradigm of Earth, Machine Sex and Other Stories, Vanilla and Other Stories, Ice and Other Stories, and The Adventures of Isabel, the first in the Epitome Apartment Mystery series. She's a writer, editor, former publisher, community advocate, and activist living in Edmonton, Alberta. So take it away, Candas, with your reading.
Thank you. I should point out that you're saying epitome ironically, and that's one of the points in the book. All the residents seem to pronounce it that way, even though it really is supposed to be the epitome of apartments. Anyway, been having a lot of fun launching this book because it name checks a lot of local places, particularly Audrey's books, which is the scene of a book launch followed by the first murder, which takes place in the alley outside. But I'm going to read just the beginning of it. The sections of the book are numbered sequentially. They're not really chapters, they're just numbered sections. And the first one is titled Once Upon a Time When the World Was Young. During our second year of university, Priscilla Jane Gill's cat Micah died, and she had him taxidermied. We all thought this was gross, but she said he was the truest being she'd met up to that point. She said that when she was in touch with Micah, she had been able to tune into a special place, in touch with the purity to which she could only aspire, and that reaching for such purity gave her life a through line of calm. She wanted to recall that clarity every day, and she thought she would do so when she looked at his effigy posed in a lifelike facsimile of his favorite meatloaf lounging position. In those days, this sort of explanation made sense. Besides, Priscilla was a folklore major, and they were all a bit like that anyway. I think all of us saw Priscilla a little like she saw Micah, when he was alive, of course. To us, she was a symbol of a time out of time, a pure zone between childhood and real life, where we could dream of a perfection for which we would not even remember to try once we'd put our college days behind us. But Pris didn't distinguish between college life and reality, and that set her apart. Maybe she was an early adopter of adulthood, or maybe she was a pure idealist. Either would have made her a wonder to us. We loved her evolved nature. She was an exotic, but she was our exotic. And long after we graduated, her image stayed with us, delicately posed in our history, perfect and without entropy, like a saint, or like Micah. We got used to Micah's ghost, as we called him, after a while, and some of us also were able to take Pris for granted now and again, until she breezed out of our lives on graduation day, wearing not much of anything under her graduation gown, and became one of our memories of university life, preserved in the amber of time, which is to say, idealized and mostly forgotten. None of us had seen her since, but any time any of us encountered each other, sometime in the conversation, we were bound to mention Pris and smile and shake our heads at our inability to match her grace and asceticism. The woman at my door that cold October day was tall, ascetic, and stylish, with a gray brush cut and the hollow, perfect cheekbones of a clothing retailer's anorexic display figure. When I opened my door, she was looking away down the corridor, and I saw her strong raptor profile with the mysterious thrill of buried familiarity. I thought I heard someone. Oh, never mind, the woman said, turning her gaze back to me, and smiled. Then I truly recognized her, that crooked supermodel smile with the trickster underlay. Priscilla Jane, I said, with that tone of satisfied arrival with which we greet the inevitable return of unfinished business. So that's how it all begins.
How is it? We find out that Priscilla Jane is quite famous. How is it that our detective doesn't know that? Like over the years, you talk about her as being in the past. Is there a sense in which you have two Priscilla Janes in mind?
Well, a little later, when they're sitting drinking tea and Priscilla's asking for her help, they do talk about how the points where the narrator would know about her were when she was, off in somewhere writing a book and having travel adventures and so on, wrestling an alligator in Australia kind of thing. And so there's a bit of ironic interplay around, because of course Priscilla Jane says, "Well, I thought about you too," and I always imagined I was talking to you, and the narrator kind of says very dryly, "Yeah, I like that too," because there has been no contact for a couple of decades. So it is kind of known, but that's not the same as personal knowing,
Yeah. I guess it's just one of those things of, when the assumption is she'd probably have been the most famous person of the group. And yet when you recall her, the narrator and the group recall her, they recall her for having taxidermied a cat, like this, and so it's interesting, the elements of where portions of the story and the narrative become crystallized in amber, because it starts to happen with other characters as well in this story, where you have the person as you know it, and then it becomes the person you didn't know beyond that in two or three different offshoots. So it's an interesting way to introduce us to Priscilla, because it becomes the imprint of how we handle some of your characters. I think, which is probably just glorious coincidence, but I wouldn't put it past you having thought of it all to begin with, just knowing you.
I seldom tell the secret of how I write, but I'm sure that a certain amount of this all gets done in my subconscious, because things are like, when I type, they're already kind of there, but then I look back and I think, wow, did I interlink those little bits like that? And that was pretty good. And what I recall is that I was typing. So so clearly the subconscious has a big role in storytelling, in putting the elements of story together. And I'm very proud of my subconscious sometimes, because it pulls off these things, these little things in the background, and I sort of look back and say, wow, because one of the rules of these books, for the first two anyway, unfortunately the third one is proving to be just a tad recalcitrant in terms of this rule, but was that I wrote them in order. So I didn't actually know anything that was going to happen when I started writing them. And yet, as I went through, I kind of buried things that became significant when later events happened. So how does a writer even do that, right? How do we do that? I think if your whole mind, including the unconscious parts, knows something about the rules of story and storytelling, then that kind of happens. It doesn't, I mean, makes it sound accidental, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is that the work is done sort of before the telling.
Mhm.
And as one tells more and more stories, you can balance more and more elements. You try to do different subtler nuanced things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But and sometimes they're conscious and sometimes they're not, because you can also bring conscious pressure to this process. And
Yeah.
your educated, intelligent, thinking mind that's paying attention to everything in the world will say this process would be better if we added some of these other ingredients on the way while typing, right? So you're typing and you think, this should be a thing, I'll type that in too. So it's this weird mix of kind of the intuitive, which isn't really intuitive, the internalized storytelling mechanism, and the additive process as one tells the story
In
to add the details.
in the detective fiction world, there's the division between the plotters and the pantsers, which is what they refer to as the people who write by the seat of their pants. And my theory has always been that there is no advance big enough to make me want to be a plotter. It has to be fun, and to me, writing by the seat of your pants is sort of like, riding a big Ferris wheel or, a roller coaster, because you just never know if it's all going to work out or not.
But I also teach writing, and over the years, I've also known a lot of writers, and I've known the kind who do the intense plotter thing. And I think of it as one particular friend who had one of those little tiny clotheslines you get for hotel rooms with the teeny little clothespins.
Yeah.
And she would put these up, index cards, clothespin to these lines on her bulletin board. And there was always a time when she had to take all the index cards down and rethink the book. And once I started writing long forms, novels, there's always a time as a pantser, when you have to sit down and say, there's a plot hole and I need to consciously fill it. And my general statistical, you might call it anecdotal statistics, say that these happen about 1/3 of the way and 2/3 of the way through any book.
Mm-hmm.
Like in gathering the statistics from all the writers that I have known. So that's why I say it's anecdotal. It's not, it's what do you call it? Qualitative rather than quantitative research. But to me, those are the moments where we each come up against the difficulties of our chosen drafting format, if you will. And of course, it's a whole continuum. So people are not either one or the other. It's like it you can be anywhere on the continuum. Sometimes I joke that if you have 20 writers in a room, you have 21 writing methods.
Yeah.
Because there's always something. But I think that those are the moments as novelists where we have to sort of say, okay, then, if I'm going to be able to stay on the roller coaster and not know what's coming, I do have to supply myself with some structure at this point, and then over here at this point. And sometimes at the end, when you read through it, there'll be a thing that you took for granted, and you have to go back and put that one or that thing in. I wrote a book which it wasn't exactly a murder mystery, but it did have a murder in it. And it was something that was significant to all the people in the little cluster of protagonists. And I had never showed the actual scene of discovering the death.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized it was because as a writer, what I was interested in was the reactions of everyone to the event, not the actual
Event.
event. But
Yeah.
I got to the end of the book and I thought, that's a cop out. You cannot not show that, because that's the hinge on which a later part of the book turns, and the readers have to see it so they
Yeah.
can react to it.
Yeah, they need a
And
reaction
so,
time too.
I had pantsed my way in essence through, and then I had to go back and analyze plot. Whereas plotters, what happens I've noticed to them is they get to a point where they have to push off and jump into the void, jump off the cliff, and just let the story move them along. Given what structure they've set up, there's a logic to it, and they just have to keep going.
Mhm.
And that's when they take the index cards down and rewrite them, and sometimes that's when they go through their terrible moment of existential angst, because they have to let go
Yeah.
of the monkey bars and just jump, you know. And whereas for us, we're constructing the monkey bars in whatever direction we want them to go, and at a certain point we may discover they're structurally unsound, and we have to put in another couple of supports over here before we can
Yeah.
climb way over there. That's a
Speaking
good
of your
metaphor. I'm going to use that.
supports and structures, you've got these modern nursery rhymes that you base each book on. And you've already named the third book, so you've had them in advance. How much of that informs your plot?
I was just asking myself something like that today, kind of thinking about this conversation we were going to have, because for the first two, I honestly can't remember how that came about, but I know that it came about kind of simultaneously with the writing of the book. It wasn't there before, and it wasn't imposed after. The third one, I knew the nursery rhyme I wanted to use because I had a general idea of what needed to happen, and it was all based on sort of the man who wasn't there. But that title had been used a lot of times, so I moved further on in the rhyme, um, and it was kind of applicable. But the thing I remembered was like a 4-line rhyme, and it turns out to be an actual, like the others, an actual poem that someone wrote in 1899, and had lots more lines to it. And when I discovered that, I was actually kind of relieved, because that only 4 lines, I was trying to figure out how I was going to divide the book into only 4 pieces, whereas this has like 12 lines. So then I've got my overarching structure, but I didn't know that when I started out. So the third one's been more conscious, but
Okay.
I can't actually remember anymore how it is that these two, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Priscilla Jane, Mary Jane, they were, so did I name Priscilla Jane to fit the rhyme? It's possible. Or did I think of the rhyme because I had just named Priscilla?
Interesting. Okay, now I'm going to jump to something else. You talk about the ironic use of the Epitome Apartments, and you have a lot of, well, the narrator creates a lot of footnotes of, sort of explanatory footnotes that could be seen as rather patronizing to the reader, because it's always, oh, look it up, and the assumption that the reader wouldn't know what the narrator is telling them, right? And yet there are various things that are implicit in the way that you've written that you don't have footnotes for. Like, for instance, the your nameless detective is very much a tribute to Dashiell Hammett's Continental Law, the nameless detective. And you have your nameless detective buying the apartment, just like Walter Mosley's Easy Rawlins buys the apartment, but doesn't tell people, and creates his world. And you even have the cat, which just like Rita Mae Brown's Sneaky Pie offers enough information, and also is that kind of ironic counterpart to the cozies that always have a cat underfoot. So all of those are obvious tips of the hat to mystery readers who know their stuff, and you leave that as we all know who we are kind of thing, and yet you have this whole series of footnotes that are explanatory to the reader. And so
Well,
what does that
you
do in terms of your narrator? Like, what are you how are you situating your narrator? Do you want her to be less likable, or do you want her to be putting herself higher than her neighbors, or how do you see that?
Well, that's really interesting, because the two processes you describe are my narrative voice
Mhm.
and her
Yeah.
narrative voice. And she's a bit snarky, right? She's lived alone for a long time, and when that happens to people, you discover that they change a little in relation to the world, compared to people who are constantly forced to actually interact on an hourly basis with other humans. And it doesn't make them less good people, it just makes them people who've lived alone for a long time. And I have several friends who've lived alone most of their adult lives, or all of them, and they have their little areas of eccentricity. So the narrator's area is kind of words and a sense of being surrounded by word Philistines who insist on saying things like it's a dog world or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm not unhappy with her having an edge, because she's not, like, one of the things you allude to the fact that I reference kind of subtly all sorts of mystery tropes, and
Mhm.
in addition, each book has its own kind of overarching trope that I'm in some cases almost satirizing, but not really, because I love these books, and I do take seriously the whole sort of moral fiction aspect of mystery fiction, which we've talked about before in the event for the last book, I think. And but I also recognize that some of these traditional forms have their weaknesses. But that's sort of what makes them, quote, postmodern mysteries, which is their subtitle. But one of them that I will not undertake is to turn my character into a vigilante.
Mhm.
She's not alone in her quest for justice. She works through systems that are imperfect, and it becomes even more obvious in the third book that the justice system, as we know, is divided in where we live into three parts: the legislative arm, the courts, and the police. And police, I mean, we know a lot about the tumultuous relationship that police are growing to have with society. And recently I've had a really interesting example of that in my own backyard, but I'm not going to go there
But you
today.
have a good policeman in Roger, a very good.
But see, I worked for 17 years on a committee with the Edmonton Police Service to basically advocate for equality of policing the LGBTQ plus community. And when we started, there was no hate and bias unit. There wasn't even a tick box on the report form for whether this was a hate motivated crime. we helped cause that to happen. And eventually other committees grew up like ours for a liaison with different communities. But what happened in that was that I met a range of police officers and senior brass. And some of them were good and some of them were, yeah, and a couple of them were clearly off in their own place. And again, I'm not going to go there too deeply, but what I discovered was that, good cops hate bad cops more than probably than they hate perpetrators, bad guys, perps, whatever, because bad cops break justice, right? So good cops, and the other thing I discovered, which I talk about in the book, is that you'll be having a conversation with a good cop and something quite innocuous in our lives will come up, and suddenly the cop backbone inserts itself into the conversation, or the cop broomstick, depending on what your metaphor wants to be. And it's like, and that occurred when? Can you give me a few details? And
Yeah,
who was that
no,
again?
no, I'm
And you
not
think,
naming
no, no,
names.
no, no, no. Law enforcement suddenly became there, like popped up. So I know that they exist, but I
Mhm.
also know that the bad apples exist. So when she's working for justice, she's picking trustworthy, straight arrow type police that she really feels she can rely on. But she is never going to go out there with a gun or her fist. She is never going to be Jack Reacher. She is never going to be, not even Tom Cruise. She is not, she does not buy, and mind you, she's Canadian too, which doesn't hurt. I mean, one of the joyous moments I had was right at the end of watching Ann Wheeler's movie Loyalties.
Mhm.
And I don't want to give away the last little moment, but it distinguished between when you have a criminal in your vicinity, what you do. In US TV and movies, what you do is you take justice into your own hands and bam, right? And in her movie, she had some people looking for justice, and one of them was carrying a gun. And yet something different happened because she understood that in the real world, what we do is different. We don't go into vigilante world. So my nameless protagonist is not going to have a fist fight. She's not going to be violent. How is she going to press back against the world? And this is a very long circle to your question. She's going to press back by holding firm to her own values, but also with a degree of snark, because she's old enough now to have become disillusioned about whether just wanting to fix the world is enough. Just wanting
Mhm.
to change the world or improve the world is enough. She understands the failures of justice, like small j justice in the world, or maybe justice the ideal in the world.
Mhm.
She doesn't have as many illusions left as she used to about what's going to happen just because she goes for justice. So there's a level of kind of cynicism and disillusionment and snark, and that comes out more verbally and more in terms of sarcasm and in terms of a kind of edginess in dealing with the world in certain ways. And I think, although I haven't talked about it as much until this exact moment, I think that's where she defines her assertive or aggressiveness, not in terms of the fists that will solve the problem, but in terms of the intellect and the drive and the force that will solve the problem is an internal force. That makes sense.
It does. And then you get, you develop her and you present her as edgy and prickly, and then love occurs, and she is seen for who she is by, Saint Nathan of the billions, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
how when that happened, how did you feel? Like when he came in and into the scene and you suddenly went, oh my God, they've fallen in love.
Oh, that was, I mean, yeah, how did I feel indeed? Because it's like, oh, that's not expected. And look at that. Look at that armor just getting shed. Like, it was fun to write. It was fun
Yeah.
to write that stuff and fun to write her sort of finding the soulmate. Of course, then I discovered what had to happen later, and we won't talk about that,
No.
okay? But I have to say that as a writer, I was a bit heartbroken about some of the things that became obvious had to happen later in the book, and not just about Nathan, but about others in the book who
Mhm.
go through what people go through in novels, in crime novels. So, because I was discovering it as I went along, I got to feel sort of the same kind of sadness and horror and grief and misery and outrage that the characters felt, because seriously, I have to do that? Universe, you're telling me that to make this story work, I have to do that to my characters? And the answer, of course, is yes, you do.
Yes,
You have
yes,
to
you
do
do.
terrible things to your characters.
Well, let's move off of that so we don't ruin the ending for anybody who hasn't read this lovely book yet. But what I would like to talk about now is she meets somebody with pots of money who says, what would you like to do with pots of money? And one of the things that comes out of it is, let's discuss things with Gabor Mate and see if we can get things going in the inner city. And I wanted to know, have you met Gabor Mate?
I have sat in the audience in the front row of Gabor Mate. And I've read the amazing book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts.
Mhm.
And that's the limit. But it is really clear when Gabor Mate walks into the room that he is used to being the smartest person in the room, and he's almost always right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes, I've
he
heard
is.
him talk too. He's an amazing character, and I think he's one of the people that should be presented in all facets so that everybody knows of him.
I mean, I would love to meet him in a situation where you could actually sit down and have a conversation, because I once interviewed David Suzuki for an article, and I had to meet him at the airport. And he was, just about to take off, and so I had like this little amount of time. And when you're talking to a person that smart, you actually have to prove your credibility before they will actually talk to you properly.
Mhm.
And so to try and do that in that amount of time, and then get him not just giving his rehearsed answers, was really hard. And I could imagine the same thing with Gabor Mate. If you met him at a pre or post event party, and you shook his hand and you were one of all the people, you might not get through that initial shell of careful interaction with strangers. Whereas it would
Mhm.
be kind of fun to be like stuck on an airplane side by side, or in a situation where you could actually have the conversation and go past the superficial moment. And the older I get, the more interested I am in going past the superficial as soon as possible, because I feel like I no longer have a lot of time to fool around with either preliminary small talk, or with my own sense of whether I'm adequate or inadequate to that conversation or relationship. I just want to get at the content, get at the thing. And he's certainly on my short list of people I would love to be stuck in an elevator with, for sure, because um uh,
Can't
reading,
you just
like,
say a
I live in
dinner
the.
party? Why do we have to be stuck in an elevator, Candace?
Well, that's true. Dinner party, sushi. Um, I mean, I live in the inner city, as you know, but maybe our listeners won't. And the issues around homelessness and addiction and mental illness and housing are complex and nuanced, and people want them in Twitter length sound bites, but you don't get that. And reading his book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, I would recommend it to anyone who wants to know anything about the nuanced environment of these issues, because he sets it out so beautifully and clearly in a combination of like a really strong qualitative research is cited, but also here's the context, here are the people, here are the faces that I saw daily, and here's what I did, and so on. It's fascinating. So to go back to your question and the book, it is definitely wish fulfillment to say, here's a guy with a lot of money and he wants to throw it at housing, homelessness, and harm reduction. That to me is like, oh, if I had money, if I won the lottery, I know where my money would go, and it would not go to yachts in the Caribbean. You know, a little bit would go to my comfort, and a lot would go to setting up some of this stuff. And I might not even set up an arts foundation anymore. I might just go straight for homelessness and harm reduction, because to me that's one of the biggest issues. So I got to actually have someone there for a while who could fix it.
Yeah.
And to my mind, that's the fantasy element in this book. You know, I've been known for writing speculative fiction. Well, that's the fantasy that won't happen in the real world.
Yeah, no, and it's a wonderful dream as you take us along with it. You know, it really is. But okay, I am cognizant of the time. We've only got 20 minutes left, and we've got lovely people here to chit chat with us. So does anybody have questions for Candace? And can you find the typing box in the chat to do it?
While they're possibly typing,
Yes.
I want us to talk for a minute, because we've both set books recognizably in Edmonton. Like the first book was more ambiguous, but it still name checked a few Edmonton places. The second book, I just took the gloves off and said, okay, you know, I'm not going to name the city, but anyone who is familiar is gonna know the places. Yeah. And I think it would be interesting to talk about sort of the landscape. Like, do you let me ask you this question. Do you think that the landscape of a book, that the intimate landscape of the place we know, okay, starting the question slightly, do you think that because we're setting it in the intimate landscape that we know, that there is any different quality or nuance to the book? Or do you think we could set the books, like if I decide to set the book in New York City and I did all my research, would it be as interesting a book? Is there something about the home territory for a writer?
Well, I think there is. I mean, it's a twofold response from my sense of it. One, your location in mystery fiction is highly important to your readers, because, of course, if you were to distill a mystery novel down to its absolute parts, they're all the same. You know, there's a murder, it's a puzzle, there are clues, and there's an answer. So what we bring to it is character, location, and social questions, social consciousness questions. So location becomes the place that the readers go to discover. And one of the things that I played around with was elements contingent to the university. And somebody once said, there's a lot of grimy areas in Edmonton. Why wouldn't you put your bodies there? And I go, well, that's fine and dandy, but that would be the assumed place that you would find a body. And I want to take you somewhere else. I do think that our books are different than if you were to set them in New York. And this is something Eric Wright said years ago, was that just, we are that kinder, gentler nation that George Bush was after. And the idea that crime happens here, as you were saying with the Ann Wheeler film, in a much different way. We approach crime differently. We approach, people are more likely to get knifed in Canada than they are to get shot. Knock on wood, that continues. I mean, God, yeah. Let's keep knifing people, Janice. No, you know what I mean. But the idea is that we understand the how intimate one has to be to commit a crime in Canada. So it makes the story different. It's not something, that you would be just randomly shooting people across the street or from, your little duck blind in your car. It becomes much more intimate, and that makes a much different kind of crime.
And yeah, and with writing in a Canadian setting, I think, and Gail Bowen is here and can probably talk to this as well. I think that because we have this sort of possibly completely wrong image of ourselves as the kinder, gentler nation in a way, or the way we have been kinder and gentler has some issues around it. But I think that means that we can actually play on the tension of crime and darkness can occur in this supposedly kinder, gentler environment, and look at how differently we might approach it than the kind of FBI breaks the door down, vigilante justice, whatever, that we see in the media we often consume. Omar Muallim, in his wonderful book Praying to the West, on page 9, I remember, why do I remember the page number, but he said this beautiful thing about Canada. He said, Canada is a failed colonial experiment struggling to live up to its multicultural mythology. And I just thought that's a perfect example. It encapsulates some of the things of our past that we don't want to remember, but it also captures our struggle to try and live up to something that's an ideal. And so people who see racism in Canada, they say, that's not really Canada, or that's not my Canada. It is, but it also isn't, because they want it to be a better, more just society, right? And I think that when you're in that environment of desiring a just society, and yet you see that the processes of injustice continue to moil under the surface, that actually gives us a unique opportunity to set the two processes against each other in a nuanced way. I think it's very interesting.
We have a question that sort of follows along here in our idea of, what's particularly Canadian. The Adventures of Isabel came out in the UK. Was your experience promoting it in the UK and different than promoting it in Canada?
Yes, and I have also got a German story too to tell about that before we're done, if I have time. The UK edition came out this August, and it was much more promoted for the LGBTQ plus themes. I mean, my protagonist is ambisexual and lives in a world of with a lot of people of many different orientations, genders, and identities, and that became more of the focus over there. It's kind of interesting because I had fun writing these books, but I'm beginning to think that saying that relegates them into cozy land, and that's not the kind of fun I had.
Yeah.
Right? someday I may put a recipe in the book just so that I can completely subvert that
And a
part. But
crossword.
I know. but the fact is they're not cozies, but they were the writing process that I used for them was different, and it was more enjoyable, frankly, than suffering and being angst ridden for my art, right? Um, I suffered for my art, but not as much in these books, right? And I think that may have been a mistake with the first book to kind of say, oh, I had fun, because I did, but saying so kind of lofted it
Diminished it.
into a
Yeah.
different place. And whereas in the UK, they took it, they read it for how they read it, and then the publicist was clearly putting it into queer space, as it were.
Mhm.
And so I did guest blogs, and I did interviews with LGBTQ podcasts, and it was also chosen as is it Blackstone's books, the bookstore there,
Waterstone.
Waterstone,
Yeah.
Yeah. Indie Book of the Month. So it was in a lot of windows and on their feature
Mhm.
displays, which was great. I mean, it was wonderful, but it wasn't so much the physical locale as it was the kind of psychosocial locale that was important to them. Now,
And then what about Germany?
well, Germany. Okay, so the rights were sold to Surkamp Verlag, which is quite a prestigious publisher in Germany. So that was kind of a great thing for both ECW and me. But one apparently expects not really to hear about it, and eventually the book comes out and you find out via sidewind kind of thing. But I got I did a guest blog for something called crimereads.org or something about murder ballad, a particular murder ballad, and it was Gail DeVos's fault, and she's here today, so I can give her full credit, because she asked about murder ballads, and I ended up diving into one. And so when I had to do this guest blog, I just wrote up my little process, my little journey, my shallow dive into the very, very deep pool of folklore around murder ballads. And so then I get this email, and it says, greetings from Germany. It looks just like spam, but it wasn't. It was the guy who heads this mystery line at Surkamp Verlag, who also has an online crime magazine called, oddly enough, Crime Mag, and he wanted to redo this blog, and he said, oh, and by the way, your book comes out in December. Apparently, it's coming out in its release date is in 2 days.
Ooh.
So I think great, and I sort of say to him, oh, how did they enjoy translating all these word plays and jokes? And he said, oh, we had this really good translator, and he gave the name, and I was able to look them up and discover that, yeah, they have a great reputation. And then he said, but unfortunately, even though I loved your title, I had to change it. We had to change it because it wouldn't work in our market. So even though I love the Adventures of Isabel title, we've changed the title. It's now called Drag Cop.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, then. All right, I said, since it was too late to do anything. I said, don't you worry that the readers might open the book and discover that it's not really about that. But apparently no, they're trying for, a diverse demographic, a younger demographic, and they have this cover that has the rainbow flag behind an outline of a police person, kind of gender ambiguous, but with a big diamond earring type diamond stuck on the graphic. And so it'll go where it goes, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with Drag Cop. It has, my partner is saying, I live in a house with a person who wrote a book called Drag Cop. I don't know about this. But that sort of happened over there without really knowing. So apparently in 2 days, that book's going to have its launch, and it's already in the catalog. You can look it up.
Oh, fantastic.
But,
Well, we're
drag
coming
off.
toward the
Not it.
end of things here, and Anita has just shown up, but I would like to mention to everybody again, What's the Matter with Mary Jane is very easy to wrap. So if you still have people on your Christmas list to buy for, this is a very good choice. Thank you, Candace, for your thoughtful conversation as usual.
Well, and thank you, Janice, for wonderful questions. And, Janice and I could really talk for a very long
Canada.
time. So I want everyone to know how much self-control it takes to actually, wrap up this conversation when it's going so well. And I want to thank ECW and Anita for putting this together, and Audrey's for co-sponsoring the launch. And I want to thank all the people who came, and I want to thank Janice for being such a wonderful interrogator. and so yeah, I'm going to hold up the book again because I can, and I hope that people enjoy it.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Candace. And also special thanks to Claire, publicist, who also helped to put this together. Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.